Karen slaps child with Down syndrome at playground 4 cutting line. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a warm, sunny afternoon at the local public park, the kind of day that drew families and children outside to soak up the rays and enjoy the clear blue sky. The park's playground was buzzing with activity as children ran, laughed, and played, their joyful voices mingling with the occasional shout of excitement or the rhythmic squeak of swings in motion. The playground equipment, well-worn and colorful, was filled with eager kids, climbing the jungle gyms, sliding down slides, and playing tag in between. Parents gathered on the nearby benches, chatting among themselves, keeping a watchful eye on their little ones as they navigated the maze of slides, swings, and climbing bars. Karen stood by the swings, her arms crossed over her chest as she kept a watchful eye on her son, Lucas. He was just a few steps away, standing in line with a group of children waiting for their turn to go down the slide. Karen, a woman in her late 30s, prided herself on being an attentive mother. She had spent the last hour or so watching Lucas run around with his friends, but now, as they neared the slide, her focus had shifted entirely to the line of kids waiting for their turn. Lucas had been eagerly waiting for his turn to climb the ladder and slide down, and Karen could tell he was getting impatient, his eyes glued to the child who had just gone down and the vacant slide awaiting the next rider. She was used to moments like this, moments when Lucas's excitement would bubble over, especially when there was something he really wanted to do. It wasn't unusual for children to get restless in line, but Karen had already promised him that they would go home soon, and she didn't want any delays. As Karen scanned the area, keeping track of her son's place in the line, she noticed another child, about the same age as Lucas, suddenly darting ahead, bypassing the other kids and rushing to the ladder of the slide. The boy had a slight shuffle in his gait and a focused, determined look on his face. He was a child with Down syndrome, and Karen could see him trying to climb up to the slide, his movements slow but steady. He had jumped ahead of Lucas and a few other children, and in the process, he had cut in line. It was a small thing, just a child eager to play, but to Karen, it was a breach of the simple, unspoken rules of the playground. She had been standing there for a while, watching as Lucas patiently waited his turn, and now this child was jumping ahead without any thought or apology. Karen's patience, already wearing thin, snapped. In her mind, there was no excuse for cutting in line, regardless of who the child was. She watched as the boy grasped the ladder, his face intent on reaching the top, his hand gripping the metal rungs. Karen's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as the frustration built up inside her. The other kids in line, including Lucas, were now watching the scene unfold, and Karen could feel the heat of their gaze as well as the stares of some of the other parents who were close by. The boy's sudden movement, though innocent, seemed to disrupt the smooth flow of things, and Karen could no longer contain her irritation. Without thinking, Karen walked over, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She reached the boy just as he was about to climb up, and before she could even process what she was doing, her hand shot out and slapped his hand hard. The sound of the slap rang out, a sharp, startling noise that cut through the chatter of the playground, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The boy recoiled in surprise, his face scrunching in confusion as his hand pulled back, the slap stinging his skin. Karen's breath quickened as she glared down at him, her voice loud and commanding. "You don't cut in line," she said sharply, her tone laced with anger. "There's a reason people wait their turn. It's not fair to others." The boy, wide-eyed and stunned, looked up at Karen, his lip trembling slightly as he processed the scolding. His movements slowed, his hand still hovering near the ladder. He had no words, no response, just a look of confusion mixed with hurt. The other children watching from behind the line fell silent, unsure of how to react to the sudden confrontation. It was clear that the boy hadn't intended to do anything wrong, he was simply excited, eager to join in the fun, but to Karen, his actions had been a blatant disregard for the rules of fairness, something she wasn't about to let slide. From across the playground, the boy's parents, who had been standing a few feet away, immediately turned their attention toward the scene. At the first sound of Karen's raised voice and the slap, their faces shifted from casual observation to concern. One of the parents, a woman, rushed over, her eyes wide with worry as she approached Karen and the boy. She wasn't angry yet, but it was clear that she wanted to understand what was happening. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" the woman asked, her voice calm but firm, the protective instinct of a mother taking over as she moved toward the situation. Karen didn't immediately answer. Her mind was still caught in the whirlwind of anger and frustration that had led to the slap. She stood there, her arms crossed, still seething as the other mother looked at her expectantly. "Your son cut in line," Karen finally said, her voice stiff with indignation. "My son has been waiting his turn, and this boy just jumped ahead without any regard for the other kids. He needs to learn some respect." The woman's expression shifted from concern to surprise, then to a flicker of something else, something Karen couldn't quite identify, but it seemed to burn with a quiet intensity. "My son has Down syndrome," the woman said, her voice soft but steady, "and he might not fully understand the concept of waiting in line like other children. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He's just eager to play, and he may not be able to process things in the same way." Karen felt her stomach tighten at the words. She had assumed the boy was simply being inconsiderate, but hearing the mother's explanation forced her to stop and reconsider the situation. The child's behavior, as innocent as it seemed in hindsight, had been misunderstood by Karen in the heat of the moment. She hadn't taken into account the boy's limitations, hadn't considered that his actions were likely driven by excitement rather than malice. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Before Karen could respond, she noticed the growing presence of other parents who had gathered around, drawn by the loud scolding and the confrontation. Some looked on with concern, while others seemed to bristle with quiet disapproval at Karen's treatment of the child. Karen could feel the weight of their judgment now, and she realized, for the first time, that she had made a mistake. It wasn't about the line, it wasn't about the rules, it was about how she had reacted, how she had allowed her anger to overtake her sense of empathy, of understanding. She looked down at the boy, who was still standing frozen, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt. His mother knelt down beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder as she spoke softly to him, comforting him. Karen's heart sank as she watched the interaction. She had struck the boy, not physically, but with her words and actions, and now, in the wake of it, she realized just how far she had gone to enforce something so trivial without considering the bigger picture. The other parents around her exchanged glances, and Karen knew that they had seen the scene unfold. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and embarrassed. "I'm sorry," Karen said, her voice quieter now, the anger replaced by a heavy sense of regret. "I shouldn't have reacted like that. I didn't understand." The words felt awkward on her tongue, but she forced herself to say them. The woman's gaze softened, though she didn't speak immediately. She glanced at her son, then back at Karen. "Thank you," the mother said after a pause. "It's okay. He didn't mean to cut in line. He's just learning, just like everyone else." She gave Karen a gentle, understanding smile before standing up and guiding her son toward the slide. Karen stood there, watching them go, feeling the weight of the apology settle inside her chest. She had acted rashly, driven by an impulse to protect her son and enforce the rules, but in doing so, she had caused harm to someone who didn't deserve it. She watched the boy, still holding his mother's hand, as he made his way to the slide, his face brightening with the excitement of getting his turn. The moment had passed, but the lesson was clear, and Karen knew it was one she would carry with her for a long time. The world didn't always fit into the neat boxes she wanted it to, and sometimes, her expectations needed to be tempered with understanding, with compassion. The playground had returned to its lively rhythm after the brief tension of the confrontation, children now laughing and running freely once again, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus that filled the air with a sense of carefree joy. But for Karen, the sounds that once had been soothing to her ears now seemed muffled, distant, as though she were hearing everything through a thick fog. The warmth of the sun on her face, the pleasant hum of the park around her, and the vibrant energy of the children playing were all suddenly overshadowed by the knot of regret tightening in her stomach. She stood there, rooted to the spot where the confrontation had taken place, her eyes shifting uneasily from the playground equipment to the parents who had witnessed the scene and now seemed to give her the occasional, disapproving glance. She had done it again. She had allowed her frustration, her sense of entitlement, to overtake her better judgment, and now she was left to face the consequences of her impulsive actions. She watched as the mother of the child with Down syndrome gently guided him toward the slide, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder, and Karen's chest tightened with an uncomfortable mix of guilt and sorrow. The boy's face, once filled with confusion, now looked up at his mother with the kind of innocent joy only a child could possess, completely unaware of how his playful enthusiasm had caused such an uproar. Karen couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as she thought about the way she had treated him, slapping his hand, scolding him loudly, when all he had done was show the same excitement for the slide that any child might have. The outburst, fueled by her frustration and a misplaced sense of fairness, had created a moment of discomfort for the child, for his mother, and for everyone watching. It wasn't just the child she had wronged, it was his mother, too. She had responded with such quiet grace, understanding, and patience, even in the face of Karen's outburst. She had not retaliated or raised her voice in anger, and yet Karen had still failed to see the broader picture in the heat of the moment. Instead of recognizing that the boy's actions were motivated by pure excitement, Karen had seen them as a challenge, something that needed to be corrected. What had she been so afraid of? A momentary disruption to the flow of the playground, an interruption to her son's turn on the slide? Was that really so important in the grand scheme of things? The reality of it was that, in trying to enforce something as trivial as a line for the slide, Karen had lost sight of what really mattered, the joy of children playing, the excitement they brought to every moment, and the need for compassion and understanding. She had overreacted in a way that was unfair to the child and his mother, and she realized, as she stood there watching the boy's innocent smile, just how much her actions had been driven by a sense of entitlement that had no place in this situation. The other parents, who had been standing nearby during the incident, seemed to be slowly returning to their conversations, their expressions guarded but not overtly judgmental. Some of them had glanced at her during the confrontation, their eyes briefly meeting hers, but no one had said anything, and she felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness wash over her. She could still feel the weight of their silent judgment on her shoulders, as though she had been marked as the person who had caused a scene in the middle of the playground, the one who had made a child with Down syndrome feel unwelcome. Her mind raced with the thought that she would be remembered for this moment, for her inability to control her anger and frustration, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something important in the process. What had once been a day of relaxation and enjoyment now felt tainted, and she couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for the other parents to forget the way she had acted. Would they see her differently now? Would they continue to watch her with quiet judgment whenever she brought Lucas to the park? Karen turned her attention back to her son, who was still waiting in line for his turn on the slide. He had watched the entire exchange with wide eyes, and although he hadn't said anything, Karen could tell that he had sensed the tension. Lucas, who was normally a cheerful and patient child, had a sensitivity to the moods of the people around him, and the discomfort that had settled over her now seemed to be spilling over onto him. She saw his small face flicker with unease, and her heart sank as she realized that, in her bid to protect him from an unfair situation, she had inadvertently caused him distress. She had become so focused on ensuring that he got his turn on the slide that she had forgotten the most important lesson she had always tried to teach him: kindness, patience, and empathy for others. By reacting the way she had, Karen had set a poor example for him, one that she knew she would have to make amends for. How could she teach Lucas to be understanding and compassionate if she couldn't even do it herself in a simple moment like this? With a heavy heart, Karen walked over to where Lucas stood, his little hands clutching the edge of the slide. He looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes, as though unsure of what had just transpired. The other children had continued playing, but Karen could tell that the disruption from the confrontation had created a lingering tension that even they could sense. She knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, and looked into his eyes. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice full of regret, "I want to apologize for what happened just now. What I did wasn't right, and I should have been kinder. I'm sorry." Lucas blinked up at her, his face still a little unsure, but he nodded as if he understood. He didn't know the details of what had happened, but he could feel the change in the air, the shift in the way his mother was behaving. "I don't like it when people fight," he said simply, his small voice filled with innocence and concern. His words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Here she was, an adult, a mother, and her child was reminding her of something so simple, so fundamental, something that she had overlooked in her frustration. She had acted out of anger, out of impatience, and in the process had let that anger color her actions in a way that she knew was wrong. But now, hearing Lucas's gentle observation, Karen realized just how far she had strayed from the values she had always tried to instill in him. "I know, honey," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I know. And I'll do better. I promise." She stood up, looking once more at the playground. The boy with Down syndrome was now happily climbing the ladder to the slide, his mother by his side, watching him with love and pride. The moment had passed, but Karen's realization was only just beginning. She wasn't going to be perfect, no one was, but she had learned something valuable today. The rules of the playground didn't matter as much as the rules of respect, kindness, and patience. And it was those rules that she needed to teach not just to Lucas, but to herself. With a deep breath, Karen stepped aside, letting the moment wash over her. The lesson she had learned wasn't one she could forget, but it was one she could carry forward, and in doing so, maybe she would be a better mother, a better person, and a better role model. She watched as Lucas finally took his turn on the slide, his laughter echoing through the playground, and she realized that, despite the earlier mistakes, everything was going to be okay. The joy of the day wasn't lost, it was just reshaped. And as the afternoon sun warmed her face once again, Karen felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She could move forward, knowing she had learned something important. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the playground, signaling the end of a perfect afternoon. The air was still warm, but the heat of the day had started to wane, replaced by the coolness of the approaching evening. Karen stood by the swings, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she watched Lucas play with the other children. She had spent the past few minutes trying to collect her thoughts, to process the feelings of regret and discomfort that had washed over her since the confrontation with the boy and his mother. She had made a rash decision earlier, driven by frustration and an unreasoned sense of justice, but as the minutes had passed and the sting of guilt faded, Karen realized that the true harm she had caused wasn't just in the act itself, but in the way she had failed to pause, to reflect, and to consider the needs and feelings of others. She had been too caught up in her desire for order, in the belief that rules were paramount and that fairness had to be enforced in every situation. What had happened at the slide had felt like a simple issue of maintaining control, of protecting Lucas's right to enjoy the playground without anyone disrupting his turn. But Karen's lack of perspective had blinded her to the fact that the situation wasn't as black and white as she had believed. She had been so quick to judge the boy who had cut in line without recognizing that his actions were innocent, driven by the same excitement that any child would feel when waiting for something as simple as a slide. He hadn't intended to hurt anyone, he hadn't intended to disrupt the flow of the other children's play. Yet Karen, in her haste to ensure that Lucas got his turn, had turned an innocent child's eagerness into a confrontation. And when the boy's mother had intervened, explaining her son's condition, Karen had felt a sharp pang of shame that cut deeper than anything she had anticipated. Her son, Lucas, was still at the slide, watching the other children take turns as they scrambled up the ladder. He was laughing, his bright eyes focused on the action in front of him, his small body bouncing with energy as he waited for his turn. In a way, he had remained blissfully unaffected by the entire episode. He hadn't truly understood what had happened, but Karen could feel the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way he had been quiet and still when she had apologized to him moments ago. It had been a simple exchange, nothing too dramatic, but she could see that her behavior had affected him in ways she hadn't realized. Lucas, always observant, always in tune with the moods of the people around him, had picked up on the tension between Karen and the other mother, and now, standing beside the slide, she could feel that he was silently waiting for her to make it right. She wasn't sure if he understood the specifics of the situation, the difference between a child cutting in line and a child with Down syndrome not fully grasping the rules, but he had sensed her internal conflict, the guilt that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Karen's heart ached as she realized that, despite her best efforts, she had failed him in that moment. She had not acted as the role model she wanted to be, the one who taught him patience, empathy, and understanding. Instead, she had reacted out of frustration, not pausing to consider the nuances of the situation, not taking the time to understand the perspectives of others. As the sun continued to set, the shadows stretching longer across the park, Karen knew she had to do more than just apologize. She needed to take responsibility for her actions, not just to the other mother and her son, but to Lucas as well. She needed to show him that the world wasn't always as simple as following the rules, that sometimes the most important thing was to stop, listen, and make space for others' feelings. Lucas was still waiting at the slide, his small body bouncing slightly, eager for his turn. Karen could see how much it meant to him, how much fun he was having, and a soft smile tugged at her lips. She wanted to preserve that moment for him, to make sure that the memory of this day wasn't clouded by her mistake. Without thinking too much about it, Karen walked over to the slide and knelt down next to Lucas, her hand gently resting on his back. His bright eyes looked up at her, his smile wide and full of innocence, and Karen felt a wave of affection for him that made the earlier tension feel distant, almost insignificant. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking to him in a soft voice, careful not to let the regret creep into her words. "Lucas, I want to talk to you for a second," she said, her voice gentle but serious. He stopped for a moment, sensing the change in her tone, and turned to face her. His small hand grasped hers, his curiosity piqued by the shift in her demeanor. "Remember earlier when that boy tried to cut in line?" Karen asked, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. Lucas nodded, his face serious now, as if he were processing the situation in his own way. "Well, I wasn't very kind to him. I got upset when he jumped ahead, but I didn't stop to think about why he did it. Sometimes, people don't always follow the rules the way we expect them to. And that's okay. We have to remember to be kind to others, even if they make mistakes." Lucas looked at her for a moment, as if absorbing the lesson she was trying to impart. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, his small hand resting in hers. "It's okay, Mommy." He didn't mean it. His words, simple and direct, were like a balm to Karen's frazzled nerves, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of the situation lift. Here was her child, so innocent, so quick to forgive, offering a perspective that she herself had failed to consider. Karen's heart swelled with pride as she looked down at him, realizing that, despite her mistakes, Lucas still saw the world with a purity that was beyond her grasp. She had been so caught up in the small injustices of the moment, in the need for control and fairness, that she had forgotten the simplicity of his perspective. To him, it wasn't about the rules, it was about kindness, understanding, and moving forward with an open heart. And as Karen looked at him, she realized that the lesson she had been trying to teach him had been turned on its head. It was Lucas who had just taught her the most important lesson of all. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Karen stood up and turned to face the rest of the playground, watching the other children take turns on the slide. She could still feel the lingering discomfort from earlier, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve to be better, to do better. She had made a mistake, yes, but she was also learning from it. And that was what mattered. She glanced back at Lucas, who was now running toward the slide, eager to take his turn. As he climbed the ladder and reached the top, his face lit up with the joy of the moment, and Karen smiled, watching him with a heart full of gratitude. The park around them seemed to grow quieter as the sun set further, the day winding down and the playground emptying out. But for Karen and Lucas, the lesson had been learned, the moment had passed, and the memory of the day would not be marred by the mistake she had made. It would be remembered as a day of growth, of understanding, and of the quiet humility that came with recognizing one's flaws and taking the steps to become better. As Karen sat down on the bench, her heart lighter than it had been all afternoon, she realized that sometimes the most valuable lessons came not from what we do right, but from the moments when we admit our mistakes and learn from them. And as she watched Lucas slide down with a triumphant laugh, she knew that, in the end, that was all that mattered. Karen stood there for a moment, watching Lucas as he climbed the ladder to the slide, his small hands gripping the rungs with the kind of determination only a child could muster. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the playground, and the sounds of laughter and play filled the air once more, but for Karen, the world seemed quieter now, as if her surroundings had shifted into a different, more meaningful space. She hadn't been sure what would come after the confrontation, after the slap that had sent her spiraling into a rush of regret, but she had faced the discomfort head-on, acknowledging her mistakes and attempting to learn from them. Lucas, as usual, had been the light in the dark, his innocent perspective reminding her of what really mattered in moments of frustration and misunderstanding. His simple words, "It's okay, Mommy." He didn't mean it, had cut through the noise of her inner turmoil like a beacon, offering clarity and solace where none had seemed to exist just moments before. As she watched him now, his face filled with pure joy as he reached the top of the slide, ready to take his turn, Karen realized that she had done more than simply apologize or correct her actions. She had witnessed the power of forgiveness, of letting go of anger, and of moving forward without the weight of past mistakes holding her back. It wasn't just a lesson for Lucas, it was one for herself. The impulsive frustration that had led her to slap the boy's hand, to scold him so loudly in front of the other parents, had revealed a side of Karen she wasn't proud of. She had acted without thinking, driven by a desire to assert control over something as trivial as a line for the slide, and in doing so, had not only hurt another child but had also caused a rift in the peaceful, carefree atmosphere of the playground. But as the minutes had passed and she had taken the time to reflect, Karen realized that her actions were more about her need to control the situation than they were about fairness or the rules. She had made the mistake of assuming that her frustration was justified without considering the needs and feelings of others, particularly the boy with Down syndrome, who had only been excited to play. The confrontation had shaken her, but it had also given her the opportunity to truly see the world through someone else's eyes. She had seen the boy's mother handle the situation with such grace, such patience, and it had humbled Karen in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't perfect, and she would never be, but it wasn't about perfection, it was about learning from her mistakes, making amends where she could, and being better the next time. And that was what mattered. As the other children played around her, their laughter ringing through the air, Karen felt a wave of peace settle over her, the tension of the earlier moment fading into the background. She had apologized to Lucas, had taken responsibility for her actions, and she had seen the change in his eyes, the understanding that, even when mistakes were made, they didn't have to define the day. He had accepted her apology with the same unspoken grace that his friend had shown earlier, and it filled Karen with a warmth she hadn't expected. He wasn't upset with her, he wasn't holding on to the frustration of the moment, and in that way, he had shown her the kind of forgiveness that she needed to extend to herself. The weight of the guilt that had been gnawing at her since the incident had lifted, replaced by the knowledge that she was capable of change, of growth, and of making things right when she went wrong. The boy and his mother were no longer visible on the playground, but Karen knew that the lesson she had learned would stay with her, perhaps in a way that no amount of words or apologies could convey. It was about empathy, about recognizing the humanity in others, and about understanding that the small battles we fight, the rules we try to enforce, often pale in comparison to the greater lessons of compassion and patience. As Karen sat back on the bench, watching Lucas slide down with a triumphant laugh, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The park around her was still alive with energy, but it no longer felt like a battleground. Instead, it was a space of joy, a space where children could learn and grow, and where adults could reflect on their own actions. Karen looked around at the other parents, many of whom had witnessed the confrontation but were now lost in the routine of their own lives. No one was looking at her with judgment anymore, no one was whispering behind her back. The incident was over, and life had moved on. She had faced her own shortcomings and was now free to let go of the lingering discomfort that had threatened to spoil the day. The world was still moving forward, as it always did, and Karen knew that she had the power to keep moving forward too, with a little more understanding, a little more patience, and a lot more empathy. Lucas, satisfied with his turn on the slide, came running back to her, his face flushed with excitement. He jumped into her arms, giggling as he wrapped his small arms around her neck. Karen smiled, holding him close, feeling the warmth of his embrace as he whispered in her ear, "Thanks for letting me play, Mommy." The simplicity of his words was enough to fill her heart with a sense of joy that she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about the slide, or the other kids, or the confrontation that had taken place earlier. It was about the bond they shared, the trust they had in each other, and the understanding that no matter what happened in the world around them, they had each other. And in that moment, that was enough. As they stood up from the bench and walked toward the exit, Karen felt a lightness in her step, a newfound sense of clarity that came with letting go of the weight she had been carrying all afternoon. The sun had begun to set, casting long, golden rays across the park, and the world seemed to glow with possibilities. The incident, though uncomfortable, had opened her eyes to a deeper understanding of herself and others, and it had reminded her of the importance of empathy, of forgiveness, and of taking responsibility for her actions. It wasn't a perfect day, but it was a real one, filled with moments of growth, of reflection, and of the quiet realization that, no matter how much we may falter, there is always room to rise above. As they left the playground behind, Karen held Lucas's hand tightly, feeling grateful for the lessons they had both learned and the journey they had taken together. It wasn't just about a slide or a line, it was about life, and the willingness to face it with a heart open to learning, to changing, and to growing.